This is the image they said was impossible, not improbable, not unlikely, impossible. For 3 years, the war in Ukraine has been described by the foreign policy establishment and by the think tanks, by the retired generals on television, by the NATO Secretariat, by the State Department's public messaging apparatus as a war of attrition, a grinding, linear conflict measured in kilometers of tree lines and village names that most Americans cannot pronounce, playing out along a 200-kilometer front that barely moved, a war defined by its stasis, a war that had found, according to the consensus, its equilibrium. But this morning, Friday, April 11th, 2026, at approximately 0430 hours Kyiv time minus Ukrainian drone strike packages, combined with a ground assault that sources inside Ukrainian military intelligence describe as 18 months in the SAD, planning and 0 days in the public record, struck the Kerch Bridge, the 12-mile causeway connecting Russia proper to the occupied Crimean Peninsula, not once, not twice, but with a sustained, coordinated campaign of strikes that has rendered the bridge operationally unusable for the first time since the war began. At precisely the same time, a second axis opened. Ukrainian armored and infantry forces, equipped with a weapons package that sources say was transferred in secret over the preceding 90 days by 3 NATO member states whose names have not yet appeared in any public reporting, crossed the administrative boundary of Crimea at the Perekop Isthmus, the narrow land corridor that connects the peninsula to the Ukrainian mainland, and established a defensive lodgment on ground that has been under Russian military control since February 2014. 12 years, gone in 4 hours. Nobody expected this move. And now, for the first time since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the entire strategic logic of the war has changed in ways that every chancellery in Europe, every war planner inside the Pentagon, and every power broker inside the Kremlin is scrambling to understand. Buckle up. Because what follows is the full operational, strategic, and geopolitical analysis of what just happened. Why it happened now, why it was possible when it appeared impossible, and what it means for conflict that just shifted from a war of attrition into something that has no clean historical precedent and no agreed playbook. Here's what you need to understand before anything else. Because the instinct of the 24-hour news cycle will be to focus on the visual drama of the Kerch Bridge burning and miss the deeper strategic architecture that made this moment possible. The Kerch Bridge is not merely an infrastructure target, it is the logistical central nervous system of Russia's entire military position in Crimea and, by extension, the southern theater of the war. Here are the numbers that define its operational significance. The bridge carries 2 rail tracks and a 4-lane road surface. Through those tracks and lanes flow approximately 85% of all the supplies: fuel, ammunition, food, equipment, replacement personnel required to sustain the approximately 30,000 Russian troops garrisoned in Crimea and the naval assets of the Black Sea Fleet based at Sevastopol. The alternative resupply route is the land corridor through Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast, the so-called land bridge that Russia established by capturing a contiguous strip of southern Ukrainian territory in the spring of 2022. That route is longer, more vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery, interdiction, and logistically less efficient by a factor of roughly 4 in terms of tonnage per day delivery capacity. If the Kerch Bridge is operationally closed, and sources inside the Ukrainian General Staff describe the current damage assessment as rendering it unusable for heavy military logistics for a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. The Russian military position in Crimea transitions from a well-supplied fortress to a peninsula under siege, sustained by a secondary logistics route that Ukrainian forces are simultaneously targeting with the same weapons package that struck the bridge. The operational vice is closing, and the Russian commanders in Crimea, according to signals intelligence assessments described by sources with access to the relevant NATO intelligence products, knew it was coming and could not stop it. To understand why this assault succeeded, where 3 years of previous Ukrainian attempts to strike the Kerch Bridge produced damage that Russia repaired within weeks, you have to understand the specific technical evolution that has occurred in Ukrainian strike capability over the preceding 18 months. Previous strikes on the Kerch Bridge, most notably the October 2022 truck bomb attack and the July 2023 naval drone strikes, inflicted real damage, but not operationally decisive damage. Russia repaired the bridge, Russia adapted its protection measures, Russia deployed air defense assets, naval patrol vessels, and electronic warfare systems specifically designed to defeat attack profiles that had previously succeeded. The Ukrainian General Staff, according to sources familiar with their internal planning process, studied each failed attempt not as a setback, but as a reconnaissance operation, a probe that generated data on Russian defensive adaptations that could be incorporated into the next generation of the strike package. What was used this morning represents the fourth generation iteration of that learning process. It combines 6 distinct attack vectors launched in a sequenced, time-on-target protocol specifically designed to exhaust Russian air defense and electronic warfare capacity before the decisive munitions arrived at the target. We are talking about naval surface drones saturating the maritime perimeter. We are talking about aerial FPV drones attacking the air defense radar systems, protecting the bridge approach. We are talking about long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles, the British-supplied weapons that the UK government spent 6 months publicly refusing to authorize for use against Russian territory before quietly changing that policy in November 2025. For arriving at the structural load-bearing points of the bridge's rail span from a low-altitude terrain following approach profile that the upgraded Russian defenses were specifically not configured to defeat. The operation did not succeed because Russia's defenses failed. It succeeded because Ukraine methodically identified every layer of those defenses and designed a strike package that defeated them in sequence. That is not improvisation. That is operational art at a level that Western military analysts, according to sources inside the British Ministry of Defense, have characterized as exceeding anything demonstrated by non-NATO military in the post-Cold War era. The simultaneous ground assault on the Perekop Isthmus is the element of this operation that changes the strategic calculus most profoundly, and it is the element that has received the least analytical attention in the first hours of coverage. Here's why it matters at a level that transcends its immediate tactical significance. Crimea's geography is a trap that works in both directions. The peninsula is approximately 260 kilometers long and 200 kilometers wide, connected to the Ukrainian mainland by exactly 2 land routes. The Perekop Isthmus in the north, which is approximately 5 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and the Chonhar, crossing slightly to the east, which is similarly constrained. For 3 years, Russian military planners have used that geography as a defensive advantage. The narrow approaches could be heavily fortified, mined, and covered by fire, making a Ukrainian ground assault prohibitively costly. That defensive calculation assumed that any Ukrainian assault on Crimea would be a frontal push against prepared Russian defenses, unsupported by deep fires capable of reaching the Kerch Bridge simultaneously. The operation executed this morning removed that assumption by striking the Kerch Bridge at the precise moment the Perekop assault commenced. Ukrainian forces changed the operational equation in a way that Russian defensive planning had not fully accommodated. The Russian commanders in Crimea now face a choice between 2 catastrophic options: redeploy forces from the Perekop defensive line toward the bridge and logistics infrastructure to address the supply crisis, thereby weakening the defenses against the ground assault, or hold the Perekop line in strength and watch the supply situation in Crimea deteriorate to the point where the garrison becomes militarily non-functional. This is not a tactical dilemma, it is a strategic trap, and the sophistication of its construction suggests a level of operational planning, integration that sources say required assistance in targeting, in logistics, in intelligence fusion that Ukraine could not have provided entirely for itself. But here's the catch. Nobody is talking about the covert Western support architecture that made this operation possible, because the governments involved have strong political incentives to maintain plausible deniability, and because acknowledging direct participation in an assault on territory that Russia considers sovereign would cross legal and political thresholds that several NATO member governments are not prepared to cross publicly. But here's what the operational forensics make clear. According to sources with access to the relevant intelligence assessments, the strike package that hit the Kerch Bridge this morning required targeting data of a precision that only satellite reconnaissance at the highest classification level can provide, minus real-time, high-resolution imagery that identifies the specific load-bearing structural components of a heavily defended infrastructure. Target and calculates the exact weapon fusing and impact geometry required to produce a decisive structural failure rather than repairable surface damage. Ukraine does not operate that class of reconnaissance satellite. Ukraine. The 3 NATO member states that transferred the weapons package are assessed by sources to include the United Kingdom, which supplied the Storm Shadow cruise missiles that formed the decisive strike element. The targeting intelligence was, according to sources describing the planning process in general terms, a collaborative product. The Ukrainians designed the operation, Their partners provided the eyes that made it executable. The legal fiction of Ukrainian operational autonomy is being maintained for reasons that are understandable and perhaps necessary. But the operational reality is that what occurred this morning was, in its deepest structure, a NATO-enabled operation against Russian-occupied territory of a scope and ambition that goes significantly beyond any previous action in the conflict. That fact will not be publicly acknowledged. It will be privately understood by every party to the conflict, including the Kremlin. And the Kremlin's response to what it privately understands will be the variable that determines everything that follows. It gets worse. Or more precisely, it gets more dangerous when you examine the specific psychological and political environment inside Moscow in which the Kremlin must now formulate its response. Sources inside 3 European intelligence services describe the current mood in the Russian national security apparatus as a combination of genuine shock and structured fury that is more dangerous than simple rage. Because it is being channeled through institutional processes rather than expressed impulsively, Putin's domestic political position rests on several interlocking pillars. And the Kerch-Bridge-Perekop operation has struck 2 of them simultaneously. The first pillar is the narrative of Crimea's permanence. Since the 2014 annexation, Putin has invested enormous domestic political capital in the proposition that Crimea is irreversibly Russian, that its incorporation was not a temporary military occupation, but a civilizational correction, a homecoming that expressed the deepest will of the Russian people and could not be undone by any external force, a Ukrainian ground force establishing a military lodgment inside the administrative boundary of Crimea, even a small one, even a temporary one, is not a military setback within the frame of that narrative. It is a falsification of the narrative itself, and narratives that are falsified publicly and visibly in real time. On a geopolitical stage, do not merely damage the politician who built them. They create crises of legitimacy that take on their own momentum, attracting every latent political grievance inside the system to the exposed wound. The second pillar is the narrative of nuclear deterrence. Putin has, on at least 14 separate documented occasions since February 2022, issued veiled or explicit threats, suggesting that Western escalation supporting Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory would risk nuclear response. Those threats were calibrated, sources say, precisely to prevent an operation of the type executed this morning. They did not prevent it. That failure of deterrence is itself a signal that every nuclear-armed state on Earth is now processing. Let's push the scenario to its most consequential dimension, because the professional obligation here is not to reassure, but to illuminate. Worst-case scenario 1, the Kremlin concludes, and this is the assessment that sources say is being most actively war-gamed inside the alliance, that the failure of nuclear rhetoric to deter the Crimea operation requires a recalibration of the nuclear signaling posture, not a nuclear strike. The threshold for actual nuclear use remains, in every professional assessment available, far higher than the current situation. But a demonstration, a sub-strategic nuclear detonation in an uninhabited area of the Black Sea or over Ukrainian territory outside populated areas, designed to reestablish the credibility of the deterrent threat that the Crimea operation has just publicly challenged. Sources inside U.S. Strategic Command described this scenario as the demonstration shot problem and characterize it as the most acutely worrying near-term nuclear escalation scenario in the current conflict environment. The challenge it presents to NATO is that a demonstration shot does not kill anyone and does not destroy military capability, but it fundamentally alters the psychological and political environment for every subsequent decision. It reestablishes the nuclear shadow over the conflict at a moment when Ukrainian operational success was beginning to lift it, and it forces NATO governments to choose between responding in kind, which they will not, absorbing the demonstration as an acceptable cost of continued support, which is politically devastating domestically, or pressuring Ukraine to negotiate on terms less favorable than its current operational position warrants, which is the actual Kremlin objective. There is no clean answer. There is only the least bad option in a situation that the deterrence architecture was specifically designed to prevent. Worst case scenario 2 is the one that European chancelleries are reportedly most focused on, and it is less dramatic than the nuclear scenario, but in some respects more consequential for the immediate trajectory of the conflict. Russia accelerates its mobilization of North Korean ground forces, the program that, according to sources familiar with the relevant intelligence, has already placed approximately 12,000 North Korean soldiers in the Kursk Oblast theater and uses the Crimea operation as the domestic and international justification for a full second mobilization of Russian reserves that Putin has been politically reluctant to order. The Russian military has the manpower to generate additional force, and the Crimea operation, if it is successfully characterized domestically as a NATO attack on Russian sovereign territory, provides the political narrative required to sustain a second mobilization wave. Additional Russian manpower, combined with the North Korean infantry contingent and accelerated weapons production from the Iranian drone supply chain, could reconstitute the offensive capacity in the Zaporizhzhia corridor required to relieve the supply pressure on Crimea through the land bridge rather than through the destroyed Kerch bridge. The operation that Ukraine designed to impose a strategic dilemma on Russia could, in this scenario, catalyze the very escalation of Russian land power that NATO planners have been trying to prevent by managing the pace of Ukrainian capability development. Every move in this war has a countermove. The Crimea operation is not the end of a strategic sequence. It is the opening of one. The international dimension of this development extends far beyond the immediate military theater in ways that are only beginning to be processed. Here is what Beijing is calculating in the hours following this morning's operation. China has staked its international reputation, to a degree not fully appreciated in Washington, on the proposition that the Taiwan question and the Ukraine question are legally and morally distinct, that Russia's actions in Ukraine are not a template for Chinese action regarding Taiwan, because Taiwan is an internal Chinese matter, while Ukraine is a sovereign state recognized under international law. That distinction has been, at a theoretical level, sustainable. But the operational lesson of the Crimea operation, that a determined military force, adequately equipped with precision strike capability and supported by intelligence from a more powerful partner, can successfully challenge and potentially reverse a territorial annexation that the aggressor declared permanent and backed with nuclear rhetoric, is a lesson that the government in Taipei is absorbing with enormous attention. And it is a lesson the government in Beijing is absorbing with equal attention, but with the opposite emotional valence. If Ukraine can retake Crimea, the proposition that Taiwan's defensive deterrence is viable receives an evidentiary foundation it has never previously possessed. That changes the cross-strait calculus in ways that will take months to fully manifest, but that began shifting the moment the first Ukrainian armored vehicle crossed the Perekop line this morning. The historical parallel that demands acknowledgement is the Falklands War of 1982, in which Britain retook sovereign territory occupied by Argentina, with American intelligence and logistical support that was publicly denied and privately essential, and in which the psychological impact of the recapture, the demonstration that military occupation of sovereign territory was reversible, reverberated through the calculations of every authoritarian government watching the conflict. The Falklands precedent is limited because Argentina was not a nuclear power and the conflict was geographically isolated from great power competition. But the structural logic applies here with far greater geopolitical reach. The Falklands told the world's authoritarians something about British and American resolve. The Crimea operation is telling them something about the limits of nuclear blackmail as a strategic tool. That message, if it holds, if the operation is sustained, if the lodgment expands, if Russia's response does not succeed in reversing the operational reality on the ground, will be read in every capital where a leader has been calculating whether American and NATO security guarantees are worth the paper they are written on. The deterrence that nuclear rhetoric was supposed to provide has been tested. Whether it survives the test intact, degraded, or broken will be the most consequential single strategic question of the next decade. The American institutional position in this crisis is simultaneously more central and more constrained than at any previous point in the war. More central because the weapons, intelligence, and logistical support that made this morning's operation possible trace back through varying degrees of official acknowledgement to American and allied decisions made over 18 months of careful, incremental capability transfer. More constrained because the domestic political environment in Washington, in a Congress divided on Ukraine support, in an administration that has been publicly ambivalent about the scope of its commitments, does not easily accommodate the kind of explicit public affirmation of what happened this morning that would most clearly communicate resolve to Moscow. The administration is, according to sources inside the National Security Council, Currently, an emergency session developing the response framework. The options being discussed range from a carefully calibrated public statement acknowledging Ukrainian operational success without endorsing any specific territorial objective, to a private back-channel communication to the Kremlin through the Ankara channel that has served as the primary crisis conduit throughout the conflict. What will not happen, and sources are emphatic on this, is an open admission of the support architecture that made the operation possible, and the fiction of Ukrainian autonomy must be maintained, even as its operational content has been substantially demonstrated today. The gap between public posture and operational reality is one of the most dangerous features of the current crisis architecture because it limits Washington's ability to credibly communicate either resolve or restraint to a Kremlin that knows what actually happened this morning, regardless of what the press briefings say. Watch the Russian Ministry of Defense's official response statement, which will tell you, through its specific language about sovereignty, nuclear posture, and Western involvement, what the Kremlin has decided to characterize this as, and therefore what its response framework will be. Watch the emergency session of the UN Security Council, which the Russian ambassador has already reportedly requested, and specifically watch China's voting behavior and statement language, because China's reaction to a Ukrainian military operation in Crimea is the most consequential single diplomatic signal in the next 72 hours. Watch the Ukrainian presidential office's public framing of operational objectives, specifically whether Zelensky uses language that claims permanent territorial reclamation or language calibrated to avoid triggering the most dangerous Russian response options. Watch for any movement in the nuclear alert status of Russian strategic forces, which is monitored continuously by American intelligence and which, if it changes from its current baseline, will be the most consequential single data point of the entire conflict. And watch the bond markets in London, Frankfurt, and New York when they open, because the financial system's real-time assessment of escalation probability will be visible in German Bund yields, Eastern European sovereign debt spreads, and the energy futures contracts that reflect what the traders, not the officials, actually believe is about to happen. Nobody expected this move. The entire war could change. The next 72 hours will begin to reveal whether it changes toward resolution or toward something far darker. Subscribe, because this story will not wait for anyone to catch up.